Is there anyone who would like to testify on Senate File 3279 that wasn't on the agenda? I call Senator Little to present testimony about Senate File 3279, criminal background checks for firearm transfers required.
All right. Good afternoon, Chair. Thanks for having me. So 3279 is what is commonly referred to as universal background checks. Currently, a background check is required for any purchase or sale of a gun. Typically when you go into a store, like farm, or Walmart, or anywhere that sells a gun at a store. Sometimes people refer to these as FFLs, Federal Firearm Licensors, or licensees, and they are required to do a background check anytime you buy a gun from an FFL. Now, curiously and oddly and a little bit stupidly, if you don't buy it in the store, let's say I buy it just from Mr. Just here, and we somehow have found a way on armslist.com, we decide I'm going to buy a gun he has, and then we go meet wherever, it could be where do you want to meet?
Groceries.
Let's go to the grocery store. So we go to Cub Foods and we meet at the back of the parking lot late at night, and I buy his gun, and I don't have to go through a background check, right? And in fact, legally, it's not required that I get a background check if I buy a gun that way. That is absolutely 100% certifiably absurd. The only way we're going to be able to ever prevent criminals and those that danger themselves or others from purchasing a gun is if a background check is required. So that is what's known as kind of the private sale loophole. Sometimes people will refer to it as well as the gun show loophole. It's all the same loophole, which means that a private person-person sale, when neither of you are an FFL, you don't have to get a background check. So this bill would require that a background check is done in those instances. There are some exemptions, of course. The first one being, major one, is family. So if I have a son or my father wants to give me a gun, or I want to transfer that gun to my son, that would not be covered by this. That would not require a background check. I can hand down a gun. As long as, of course, my son or my father are not felons. The other one is, there's a couple of them. The other one is, sports shooting events. Perhaps we're at a tournament, my gun breaks, and then I have to borrow someone's gun for that tournament. That's okay, and that doesn't require a background check. Or there is also a hunting exemption, which if someone needs to borrow my gun, a friend of mine needs to borrow my gun for hunting, they can use it for up to 12 hours. And then I'm amenable to expanding that exemption to beyond 12 hours, but I think the hunting exemption is an important one. So those are kind of the big three exemptions, and that's the basics of the bill. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for your presentation, Senator Little. I call Minnesota Department of Education Commissioner Brenda Casilius to testify.
Sure, I do not believe she is here yet.
Okay. Then I call Edina High School student Arjun Maheshwari to testify. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Arjun Maheshwari, and I've come to testify actually in opposition to this bill. So, universal background checks can't solve the problem of gun violence in America because they're impossible to enforce without the invasion of privacy. So this bill tries to cover that with the numerous exemptions in Subdivision 9 of Section 3. However, it is those instances in which government has to intrude the most where the most problems with gun transfers are created. This is why we need more blanket reform as opposed to universal background checks. And so it's more like you're either legal or you're illegal when it comes to guns. Here are the most concerning clauses in subdivisions that I found in the bill. First, the one that he mentioned, that's the representative senators already mentioned about the exclusion for transfer between family members. This is extremely concerning because a vast majority of criminals, as found by a University of Chicago and Duke study 2013 of 99 Cook County inmates, a vast majority of criminals get their guns from family members or personal connections. So universal background checks can't solve the problem then, because then it's just a legalized loophole that's institutionalized. Second, Section 3, Subdivision 9, Clause 8 allows an exclusion if the transferor has, quote, no reason to believe that the transferee will commit a crime within. This is probably the most concerning clause of the entire bill because it allows people to use their subjective judgment to determine if the person they're transferring to needs a background check or not. The point of the bill is defeated as long as this clause is present because it gives leeway to numerous justifications for not having a background check. In conclusion, the intentions of this bill are very good, but the intricacies of the law will make it hard to prosecute people who haven't gotten a background check. In the era of partisan gridlock, I urge you to consider other methods of gun prevention, because we may only have one shot to pass the effective critical legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maheshwari. Are there any questions or comments from the committee for Senator Little or Mr. Maheshwari? Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman's concerns about the bill, well-researched and well-read. Oftentimes we try and we argue against legislation because it doesn't solve the whole problem. And that, I think, is what has held us back on a lot of conversations to reduce gun violence, because no one single piece of legislation will ever solve all gun violence, unfortunately. Universal background checks would just be one part of that. I support and have co-authored a number of other bills that would provide a more comprehensive solution. I think the gentleman points out a number of concerns with the exemptions, and those are smart concerns. But Minnesota has a long history of gun ownership, and passing a firearm down from generation to generation is something we've historically done for 200 years since people arrived in America. And so I think, you know, it's one of those things that we have to kind of allow, because we have so much history to it. But I understand the concern, and it's a good one. So I appreciate the gentleman's concern.
So this is a question that we collected earlier from one of the students who attended the White Act.
Okay.
And it is a question that goes back to what you said right now. And they asked, why would your immediate family not need a background check? And I wanted to add on to that, saying things have changed today. So as you are handing down a gun from generation to generation, it would not be the same kind of gun you would have handed down 100 years ago. And there's a lot of things that you as a parent would not know about your child's life. And I agree that it would be very hard to pass this bill if we had legislation that directly said that if you are trying to pass down a gun, you must pass it, you must go through a background check. But I feel like we should do something at least. And we cannot leave nothing at it. Because we do not know.
I guess, was there a question, or was that just kind of a comment?
There was a question.
Okay.
So if there's, like, what other response could you give to that? If history cannot be considered, like, what else could we add to it?
Well, I think we have to consider history. So I guess I would push back against the premise of the question in a way. And then also, if you're a parent, I really do feel like you know whether your child has a felony, because we're not asking you to know everything about your child. I mean, this simply would ask that you know whether your child has been arrested and charged with a crime that necessitated jail for a year or longer, and I presume that you'd notice that, and so maybe not everybody, right? But I think on a whole, parents are going to know, and family members are going to know whether another family member is ineligible to own a firearm. If I can't presume that, there's not much I'm going to be able to presume in writing any legislation. So again, nothing is a perfect solution, but this would be a heck of a lot better than what we're doing now.
Before we take any more questions, I call Minnesota Department of Education Commissioner Brenda Casilius to testify. Please introduce yourself and
Good morning, Madam Chair, and thank you for giving me a moment to speak on the issue before you and Senator Little's bill. I first want to commend the bipartisan leadership of Senator Little, Senator Kent, Senator Paul Anderson, and Senator Scott Jensen for focusing on gun violence. I think it's a sad day that we only are getting a hearing in the Minnesota Youth Council and that our Public Safety Committee isn't willing to hear these bills. And I urge our colleagues in the Senate and in the House to give a full hearing to this bill on universal background checks. I'm in full support of this bill. The governor is in support of universal background checks. And we believe that this is a small step forward to really common sense gun control. We urge the closing of the loopholes to private citizens, family members. I realize that's not part of this, but any loopholes to background checks. We think that that just is a basic protection for those who should not have guns, having guns, in terms of keeping our kids safe. There's nothing more important than keeping our kids safe in school. They can't learn if they are fearful of going to their school, whether it's school bullying or whether it's their peers having a weapon and bringing it, or they see something on social media. These things are all absolutely necessary, and as you know, the governor has brought forth a number of recommendations to keep our kids safe in school, including background checks, but also limitations on the age restriction around gun control, also around family members being able to report other family members who should not have guns, also known as red flag laws, as well as Safe Schools Levy and other provisions. I know that this hearing today is just on the universal background checks, which we are supportive of, but there are other provisions that ought to be moving just as quickly through our House and Senate to keep our kids safe. So I want to thank all of you for your continued advocacy, for your incredible, courageous leadership, and I think that your generation is going to be the generation that saves us from ourselves, quite honestly.
thank you for your presentation. I'll open it back up to any questions from the committee for Senator Little or any of the testifiers. Ms. Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I need a clarification from Senator Little. In subdivision 12 of section 2, specifically lines 1.21 to 2.06, are these lines that would require background checks or would not require background checks?
Can you state the line again?
The subdivision 12, specifically line 1.21 to 2.26.
That applies in the cases of an antique firearm. So it doesn't apply to all firearms, it's only exemptions. That's, some of that is an existing law that the exemptions apply to antique firearms, so however they're defined. If you're talking about page 1 and 2, is that correct? You can see in line 1.18, shall not apply to transfers of antique firearms as curiosities or for their historical significance or value, and then it extends into 1.21, so those are talking about the exemptions in the context of antique firearms.
Mr. Lomela.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator, specifically in line 1.18, how would antique firearms be defined? Like a specific age or something like that?
Yeah, it would just be as defined currently in statute. I don't have that in front of me about where the line is drawn for those. But it's a great question.
Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a question directly from a student who attended LIDAC. In
when is it official that the transferee has received the firearm? Are there any documents that need to be given, or is it as simple as handing it to them?
It would be as simple as handing it to them, because the FFL would conduct the transfer, would be required to conduct the transfer. So the firearm is given to the FFL during the background check. And if the individual fails the background check, or there are questions or additional investigation into the background check, the FFL holds on to that firearm until the investigation is over or they clear it. Does that answer it? Okay. Great.
Ms. Gard?
With anti-firearms, however, the exclusion 4 and 9, they're referring to pistols and semi-automatic military style assault weapons.
Yeah, I mean, I think the existing statute probably could use some clarification, and I would agree with you there. And that could be a potential amendment moving forward.
Ms. Medeiros? Would you consider making that amendment?
Sure.
Mr. Lamar?
So in line 4.15, it mentions that people applying a background check would be able to have a reasonable fee. About how much would that reasonable fee be?
Yeah, the reasonable fee is not defined. That would be up to the courts to decide what reasonable becomes. The typical amount charged for a transfer at current FFLs, you can see a pretty common charge is 25, 35 is common, 50 gets to be a little higher. The highest I've seen in some of my research was 85, but I'm sure there's higher. So it's typically $50 or less, but oftentimes enough it's $100 or less. It really depends on where you go, what the market is.
Mr. Arman?
So I just have a question for you.
Sure.
How would this come into effect now, since people already have it? Like how is that going to come about?
Yeah, like any law, it begins enforcement from a date certain. So it really would depend when this was passed. Obviously, it's written for August 1, 2018, but that would change if it doesn't pass this session. So, but yeah, it's like any law. You move forward with charges from that. So I do not think the scenario in which someone's like, oh, you have a gun, can you prove that you bought it, from an FFL this year, or prove to me that you bought it from your uncle last year? I doubt that's going to happen, because the evidence won't be there. And it's always the state's burden to prove the charge as opposed to the opposite. So they have to have the evidence. Yeah.
Mr. Grant?
I have a question for the testifier from Medina. I was wondering your thoughts on, you said that, so you were in opposition of this bill because it didn't solve the whole problem, essentially, that's what I got from it, sort of. And I was just wondering if it did help a little bit. And you mentioned we have one shot at maybe getting some kind of gun safety or gun control legislation actually passed. We have like one shot, like one major chance. Do you think that if this bill were passed, if it were to help a little bit, it would be worth it because we supposedly have one shot? And what makes you think we do have just a limited chance?
Yeah, so this kind of phenomenon of wanting gun control happens pretty much after every major shooting. Happened after Sandy Hook, happened after pretty much, yeah. So that's why I kind of feel like right now is a chance to do something. And so I wasn't necessarily in opposition to the bill. I just wanted to point out some of the things that would make it sort of unenforceable. And if it were to be enforced, it would be a major invasion of privacy by the police force, for example. And I didn't get to mention that, but yeah. So basically, I don't think it would actually have that big of an impact anyways, because it would require a large burden on the executive branch to actually go out and enforce these background checks. And even if they were to do that, they wouldn't be catching that many criminals, because criminals get them largely from outside places that wouldn't be covered under this bill. Does that answer your question? Sort of.
Slightly, thank you.
Okay, I can clarify further if you'd like. Okay.
Ms. Ramirez?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Little, do you, because the Minnesota Youth Council is the only committee hearing this bill at this time, and with the difficulty of getting a hearing for bills surrounding gun control, do you think we have only one chance?
Right now, we have no chance. And that's the honest truth. Like, the majority does not want to hear these bills. They are fighting tooth and nail not to hear these bills, not to even talk about these bills. They don't want to vote on these bills in committee, and they sure don't want to vote on these bills on the floor. We are now over a month into this session, and we've talked about cracking down on people lying about their service dogs. We've talked about expanding sales of fireworks, but somehow background checks and anything to do with guns is not important enough for them to talk about. So right now, we have no chance.
Ms. Olmert?
I just want clarification from Senator Little about the temporary transfer.
Sure.
So what would count as a temporary transfer for section 9, inclusion for number 8? So like a temporary transfer, the transfer has no reason to believe the transfer will use or intends to use a firearm in a condition of crime.
Yeah.
So for the very last one, how long would that be for ID?
So you're talking about 5.1. Am I at the right place?
5.3. Like,
Yep.
yeah.
Say that again, 5.23.
Yeah, 5.3. How long would
Yeah.
that transfer be?
Again, some of the wording will be up to the courts. And a lot of this wording in here is not ideal, right? But some of this is in here in order to gain bipartisan support and gain compromise. So things that I wouldn't necessarily want in here are in here. But that's kind of how it works. My two bills are the only two bills related to guns that have bipartisan support. So with that context, I think the temporary transfer is going to have to be determined by the courts and prosecuted by prosecutors to determine that, right? And there's going to be no set line. But if you've had the gun for a year, that doesn't really feel like temporary. But if you had it for a week, maybe that's temporary. And I think this was put in there for kind of the transfer to in the situation with divorced parents. So you could transfer it to that individual so that they could so the minor child could have possession of the gun for hunting or whatever with the other parent, if that makes sense.
Mr. Fortman?
Upon first reading the bill, I came into it with a different mindset, and after listening to you speak, I feel like the legislation itself gave me a different impression of what you intended. So my question is there a way to refine it to describe not, because I know that you don't want the invasion of privacy that this would allow, and I know that some of what's in here is, it does partially go against the Constitution and forcing people to get mandatory background checks and things like that. However, is there a way to reword it to where it would be an acceptable bill?
Say that last part one more time. Where?
I phrased it poorly, but is there a way to rephrase it to where the intention matches the language?
Yeah, and I guess I disagree with some of the premise of the question. I do think this accomplishes some of what we intend. There are exemptions, but I think a lot of those are somewhat practical exemptions. And I guess just going back to the previous question, on 5.23, like that temporary transfer is in the actual presence of the transferor, so like the transferor is still there, right, with the gun. So I should clarify that. But there are exemptions. To do no exemptions would not get this bill anywhere. So I guess I don't know another way to answer the question other than, like, if you got rid of all these exemptions, I understand the privacy concerns. But, you know, inconvenience and privacy concerns, I think, are outweighed by the reduction in gun violence that would occur by keeping keeping guns out of the hands of criminals and domestic abusers. And I assume the privacy concerns are mostly surrounding mental health. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you have a felony, that's public record anyway, so it's not an invasion of privacy.
Ms. Carter?
Thank you, Madam Chair. You mentioned that you're willing to make amendments.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that I think this law could be refined a little bit, again, referring back to the same section, section 2.
Okay.
After reading over these again, they don't all seem to be speaking in context of antique firearms.
Sure.
So if that was what you intended for the bill to do, then maybe that should be refined. But if that's not possible, then I would like to specifically talk about line 1.2, because it says that a transfer by a person other than a federally licensed firearms dealer would not require a background check, but that
Yeah.
can be
Yeah, that needs to be amended out, and I have an amendment prepared on this bill that needs to be amended out, and I think you're generally right. The way it is written, though, is confusing, and it does need to be refined, because typically when you have that paragraph up there talking about one certain type, which does antique firearms, and it goes on to list the other exclusions, that creates confusion in a court setting. So that needs to be refined. I really think that instead of the way it's laid out here, it should individually list the exemptions for antique firearms instead of making a paragraph. But generally, you're right. Some of these are exemptions overall. So, but number one is super concerning. That needs to be eliminated. Yeah.
Ms. Klantz?
Madam Chair, I have a question for the fire department. In the last statement you made, you mentioned that this would be a lot more work than with keeping the law. And would you disagree with the fact that any kind of permit form would be more work or effort than you have to do? Or is that
Yes, actually, because if you think of things like, say, assault rifle bans or even handgun bans, then it's either you're doing an illegal action or you're doing an illegal action. Either you're selling someone a handgun, which is illegal by the law, or it's legal by the law. Whereas universal background checks would require another sort of layer of bureaucracy, another layer that won't necessarily be effective.
I'll take one more question. Ms. Smith, please proceed.
Yeah, just in reference to the testifier, I was just quickly wondering if you could clarify. I feel like in the ideal world, people would be able to more widely enforce more blanket legislation, right? But I think that this is maybe one step towards that blanket legislation. And, you know, it's really hard to jump from A to C. It's much easier to go from A, B to C, you know? And I think maybe I just hesitate to, I don't know, empathize with your standpoint in a way, because I feel like I understand where you're coming from, and like, yes, I would love that legislation as well, but I think that maybe by endorsing this legislation, we can work from this legislation to get those more effective, more blanket term legislations. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that maybe a little bit.
Yeah, so I think sort of two things. First, I'd argue that universal background checks are more of that C rather than that B, because I feel like for the people who are in actual opposition to this bill, actual opposition to gun control in general, I feel like they would be more opposed to to a dealer looking into their history, looking in like a background check, as opposed to just not being able to buy and sell them. And then the second point that I wanted to talk to on that note is that, sorry, could you repeat your question?
No, that's okay. I just think that maybe this is an effective stepping stone towards
right,
getting
yeah.
that.
So the thing is, as the senator already pointed out, there's such little desire from our legislators to even pay attention to any gun control. And I feel like if this isn't going to stop the problem that we have, then we're going to have very few chances in the next decade or so to actually pass comprehensive reform, which is why I feel like this won't go in. Even if it does get passed, we won't have it. It won't be a stepping stone, is what I'm saying. It'll just be the final.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to close discussion and motion that Senate File 2379 be recommended to pass. I would like to take a roll call to vote, so when I call your name, please state yes if you would like this bill to pass, or no if you would not like the bill to pass. Ms. Munira Alimore? Ms. Alyssa DeGrand? Mr. Weston Lowmiller?
No.
Mr. Angelo Perez?
Yes.
Ms. Catherine McComas-Bussey?
Yes.
Ms. Shreya Ram, yes. Ms. Fatima Manawa?
Yes.
Ms. Elena Medeiros?
Yes.
Ms. Ava Kalens?
Yes.
Ms. Suhani Garg?
Yes.
Mr. Brian Forsman?
No.
Mr. Marvin Lopez Rosas?
Yes.
Mr. Brendan Walensky?
No.
Mr. Jacob Just?
Yes.
Mr. Robert Johnson?
No.
Mr. Noah Aaron?
Yes.
Ms. Bailey Norris?
Yes.
Ms. Hannah Erickson?
Yes.
Ms. Rhea Edberg?
Yes.
Ms. Addie Ness?
Yes.
Ms. Raina Mayer?
Yes.
Ms. Mimi Lee?
Yes.
And Ms. Harita Dugulara? Gorola?
Yes.
With 18 votes yes and 5 votes no, the motion does pass.
Thank you all for having me, and I appreciate this being the only hearing I'm likely to get this session. I just want to, now that, can I break business for just one moment, Chair? Is that all right?
Yes.
I'm just so proud of you all. What you all are doing right now is having an impact here. The fact that there's some elected officials here that don't want to do anything should not deter you. When I say no chance, that's in the moment. We have 2 more months to get something done. So don't you ever give up, and don't you ever accept no. Okay? All right. Thank you.